Good afternoon. We are now resuming our Tuesday, March 2nd, 2021 regular meeting of the Lane County Board of Commissioners. We are on item 11 at this point, Public Works. We're going to have a discussion in the matter of providing information for the consideration of a ban on polystyrene food containers, utensils, and related products in Lane County. And I believe we have here Alex Kyler and Sarah Grimm and Jeff Orlandini to lead us through the discussion.
Yes, thank you, Chair Bernie, Commissioners. That's exactly right. Our intention is just to provide information, share that with you, and then allow the board to direct us on next steps. So I get the shortest part, which is great. We'll let kind of the content experts go after that. You requested information regarding the polystyrene or styrofoam ban in Lane County. My goal is to provide a quick overview of the information contained in the board packet in regards to styrofoam bans, and hand it off to Sarah Grimm and Alex Kyler to discuss current legislation related to the issue. As you are aware, various Oregon cities have banned styrofoam takeout containers, including Ashland, Florence, Medford, Milwaukee, Portland, Silverton, and most recently Newport. Additionally, it should also be noted that a ban enacted by the Board of County Commissioners would only affect the unincorporated parts of the county and not the cities. This is not to say that a countywide ban is not possible, but our belief is that it would have to be done as a public health issue in order to be enacted by the Board of Health countywide. Or another option that we have heard would be to ban the material from acceptance at the Short Mountain landfill, which sounds like a great idea on the surface, but it really wouldn't be possible in our current system due to the nature of incoming waste and the inability to screen for this specific type of material. So anyone that's been out at Short Mountain has seen the trucks come in and the way that we receive waste. And that would be a huge undertaking to sift through every ton of waste that comes in, looking for less than 1% of our waste stream to hand pick out. From a waste perspective, Styrofoam's not at the top of our list of priorities, as it's an extremely small portion of our waste stream. And once it's in the landfill, and especially since landfills use daily cover, meaning that you're covering your landfill at the end of every day, so there's not that penetration of the sun on it for years at a time until it gets buried. Food waste and other organics are a much higher priority due to the methane produced. So styrofoam, once it's in the landfill, is not as big of a danger and a priority to us from a greenhouse gas standpoint and a safety standpoint. Of course, it's a big litter issue, and this is where it seems to have the most detrimental effects to the environment and our wildlife. We as a division do, of course, support actions that would ban styrofoam foodware, increase recycled content used in other forms of styrofoam, and create more recycle options for the material. Some of the things that I think you heard from public comment earlier from Terry McDonald. Our recommendation is to wait for the current legislative process to complete to see if any bills enacting change occur in this area. And so to start the explanation of the current legislative proposals, Sarah Grimm, who's been a member of the statewide steering committee to modernize Oregon's recycling systems that was convened by DEQ in 2018, will brief you on the current bills that are in the works. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm happy to be here and discuss this with you. I'm just going to be covering a little bit, really. There are 3 bills actually that were introduced to the legislature this spring that would likely impact the material we're discussing. All 3 of them propose to hold producers responsible for their products that are sold into Oregon, and all 3 of them name food service ware specifically as one of the targeted materials. I'll limit my discussion to the one bill that was informed by nearly 3 years of research and deliberation that I personally was involved in as a member of the steering committee. It's now called Senate Bill 582, and it has recently been amended with a -1 amendment package. It would preserve and improve on the efforts and effectiveness of Oregon's existing recycling industry and systems. It would require producers of printed paper and packaging, which does include food service wares, to pay fees into a producer responsibility organization that would then use those funds to accomplish the requirements of the law. And I'll just briefly describe a few details of the complex law and those that are pertinent to today's discussion. The law would require development of a uniform statewide list of what is recyclable in Oregon. There would be a coordinated statewide education and promotion campaign with consistent and clear instructions used by all programs across the state. This would greatly reduce confusion and reduce the wishful recycling contamination problem that is plaguing our system today. All communities across the state currently regulated under the Opportunity to Recycle Act would be required to conform to that list and set of instructions. This would benefit Lane County specifically because we currently have 3 different sets of instructions for recycling, depending on where you live and if you use a transfer station. So the -1 amendment specifies that the uniform statewide list would be determined by the Environmental Quality Commission in consultation with producers, with recyclers, and a new advisory council that would be appointed by the governor. The uniform statewide list would contain all items that are recyclable in Oregon, both those that are collected in the curbside commingling system, as well as others that must be collected separately because they are a serious contaminant to commingled recycling. Things like glass bottles or plastic bags, they simply cannot be effectively sorted from the mix, and they end up as contaminants in bales of paper unless they're kept separate. In these cases, the producers would be required to assist in ensuring that all communities have sufficient collection for those separated items in every corner of the state. To further reduce the confusion about what is and what is not recyclable, and motivate producers to effectively follow through with voluntary recycling commitments, truth in labeling laws would be strengthened and improved with fines for noncompliance. A structurally effective truth in labeling law will prohibit the sale of any products that makes deceptive or misleading claims regarding recyclability or compostability, unless that material is on the uniform statewide collection list, which would validate its recyclability, or if the claims comply with certain rules that will be established by the EQC. So brand owners and producers will be motivated to get their materials listed on the universal statewide list. Most have already been claiming lofty recycling goals or recycled content goals. Knowing how their customers feel, they will make it happen if they can. The combined truth in labeling law and the statewide list are somewhat of a stick and a carrot to motivate these producers to do what is in their power to make it so. And in fact, actually, styrofoam food service ware is an excellent example of this. We currently have the styrofoam food service ware is currently recycled up in Tigard at a company called Agilex. Basically, the styrofoam food packaging industry could build 1 or 2 or 3 more Agilex type processing facilities around the state to make it recyclable. They could begin to use more recycled content in their product or start up new product lines with recycled resin to create a pull factor in the recycling system, or simply connect collectors and processors with the current users of this recycled resin, not unlike what St. Vincent de Paul is doing with block styrofoam. Additional motivation for producers would be contained within the law within the fee structures that they'll be required to pay into the producer responsibility. The fees would be eco-modulated. That means they go up or down based on environmental impacts, paying less if their package is recyclable or has recycled content, and possibly even paying more if it is a known contaminant to the recycling. This model does require producers to pay, but not all costs, like so many places around the world. They'll be paying just the expenses of properly dealing with the packaging that they are selling into Oregon. Things like a contamination management fee, or a processor commodity risk fee, or compost facility contamination management fee. Producers would have partial financial responsibility for several aspects of our system. Number one, transportation reimbursements for communities that are located far from the sorting facilities would level the playing field and ensure equal access for rural communities to recycling. Two, cities and counties may need some financial assistance to conform to the new uniform statewide list and also to comply with additional contamination control requirements that are needed. And number three, ensuring Oregon's material recovery facilities have the systems and equipment they need to effectively remove contaminants from the materials are dearly needed. Producers would also have more full responsibility for a couple of things: ensuring effective litter and marine debris control programs are enacted through grants or direct payments to service providers. Also, ensuring that all materials on the statewide list have responsible end markets, no matter where they are in the world, that do not pollute air or water with facility discards. Finally, the law would establish a statewide recycling rate goal for plastics of at least 25% by the year 2028. In sum, if the bills pass, and that is a big if, Alex can help us inform it on that, the combination of requirements and changes that would occur in the next 5 years could potentially very greatly improve the recyclability of this material, polystyrene food service wares. This, of course, I must add, is not saying that recycling is the end-all goal. I would propose that reduce and reuse hold that place of honor. And that's it for my short description. I'm open to questions and eager for conversation.
Mr. Chair, why don't I jump in just to round out the panel here. Sarah and Jeff did a very nice job sort of teeing up this issue for you. And I'll just tell you that back in, I think it was December 8th, was when you were seated in a regular meeting and you had a lot of public comment regarding polystyrene and asking you to take up the issue of having Lane County consider a ban. And I think it really was only a matter of moments before I picked up the phone and called the Director of Public Works to say, you know, Dan, I think that the board really needs to hear about this legislative concept that's coming down the pike that I was aware of. And Sarah has just done a nice job of describing that legislative concept. I think she didn't tell you that she actually sat on the statewide recycling steering committee that helped develop this measure. And having sat on some of those interim committees, I can tell you it's an enormous amount of work, and trying to find consensus between, you know, literally dozens of stakeholders can be exceedingly challenging. So Senate Bill 582, which is a bill relating to modernizing Oregon's recycling system, is the measure that appears to be on the move. If you recall, Mr. Chair and Vice Chair Farr, we did identify that bill. We didn't really know the number of it, but we did identify it as a priority for Lane County when we had our last legislative committee meeting. And the reason that I alerted Dan to it and suggested that it be part of this topic is that I really am hopeful that this kind of framework that Sarah described, which sounds complicated, but inserts some financial pressure points on producers that will drive their decision making, really may revolutionize the way that Oregon's recycling system works. And in cases of materials like polystyrene, which can be confusing to the consumer because they often have a recycling symbol on them, and Oregonians really want to recycle. But this system will definitely be an improvement over what we've got. And one of the impetuses for this steering committee to be formed up was that Oregon's recycling rate is really going in the wrong direction. Now, you wouldn't know that by looking at Lane County's history. Our recycling rate has actually gone up pretty steadily. But if you look at the statewide list of counties, you know, for the majority of counties, the recycling rate is actually heading downwards. The amount of material being generated is heading upwards. And so we're just not getting to where we had hoped to be through previous legislative policy directives that I broadly refer to as rate and date legislation. I think with the framework that Sarah has outlined, you will see that producers of materials like polystyrene foam will have a new incentive to either switch away from that material or develop the necessary recycling infrastructure within the state to help manage it. I was going to, I think the best thing I can do is there's a section of the bill that I'd really like to read to you, just because I think it gets right at this issue of how rates will work. But as Sarah described, there will be a product stewardship program in the state of Oregon. There will be product stewardship organization, either one or more than one, that will help to manage these products, and they will establish fees. And so I just wanted to read a few parts of the bill just so you can get a sense of it. So for example, a producer responsibility organization shall establish a schedule of fees to be paid by members of the organization. Those are the product producers. The fees established pursuant to this section must be sufficient to meet the financial obligations of the organization. And then it goes on to say that a schedule established under this section must establish a base fee rate for all covered products, which food serviceware is a covered product. Now, in addition to the base fee, a producer responsibility organization shall charge additional base fees for covered products sold or distributed in or into this state that are recoverable but have higher costs associated with their recovery or are not recoverable. So you can see that's the hydraulic that Sarah used a very interesting term, eco-modulating, but that's exactly what's happening, is that depending on the recyclability or the degree of contamination that a product represents, there will be a fee established by that producer responsibility organization that a producer must pay. And if they can avoid that by either improving the recyclability or switching to a material that's more recyclable. So, I mean, I think it's a really interesting concept. We do have a couple of these frameworks already in place in the state of Oregon. We have long had a computer and television recycling product stewardship framework. We have a paint product stewardship framework. These product stewardship frameworks are very common in Canada and Europe. And so Oregon could really be leading the way if this bill passes. Now, I want to clarify one thing. Sarah said that the bill has already been amended by the -1 amendment, and that's not quite accurate. The bill is still being heard in a public hearing, and in fact is in a public hearing as we speak. Lane County did submit testimony in support of this measure. The committee that it's being heard at in the Senate is chaired by none other than Springfield Senator Lee Byer. Senator Byer and I have had conversations about this measure, and I think I think it's okay to share that he has indicated he'd like to see the measure advance. He has some concerns with certain sections of it, and he's aware that there are other members of his committee that also have some concerns. So like most things, we will probably see the iteration of yet another amendment to sort of clean up this -1 amendment. And my expectation is that his committee will then work the bill in a work session where they'll combine all the amendments into a new measure that will then head over to the House side for more discussion in the House Committee on Environment. So it's got a long way to go, but I think the signals at this point are pretty positive that it will at least get out of the Senate. So we're hopeful, and like I said, I think this measure is worth it for the board to really consider in the alternative to a straight out ban, which, as Jeff indicated, there's some problems with how to sort of manage banning materials from the landfill at a local level. So I think I'll stop there, and happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you. I always like how people stop there and then make their final statement. Thank you so much. Now it's the commissioners. This is a lot. And as the three presenters may know, we have been bombarded with emails with people weighing in on how they feel on this subject. So I would like commissioners now to have your opportunity to ask away. Commissioner Bozovich.
Thank you, Chair Bernie. Just a quick question for Sarah or Jeff, I guess. This Senate Bill 582, basically, it seems like it's setting up a system very similar to what we have with the paint industry currently in Oregon. Is that an accurate statement?
I would say it's accurate in that they are both producer responsibility requirements. I am not really deeply involved in the paint stewardship one, but to the effect that there's one difference I'm aware of. The paint stewardship one made it required that every bill, when you buy the paint, that it is visible that you are paying 75 or 50 cents extra for the recycling program. And I don't believe that kind of system is contained anywhere in this SB 582.
Thank you.
Chair Bernie and Commissioner Bozovich, I think I'd also add that it's a little different in that paint stewardship is based on a return to retail, where the consumer has to return that container to the retail system. This one, we're obviously set up in terms of recycling for either a drop-off mechanism like we run through our transfer stations or curbside recycling programs. So there's sort of an added level of collection to consider when we're looking at the framework by Senate Bill 582.
Thank you. Commissioner Buck.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question. So I very much support our efforts as a county to get behind Senate Bill 582. The question specifically is on our discussion today regarding this serviceware that is currently not recyclable and not made of materials that can be recycled. So folks are probably questioning, why are we talking about Senate Bill 582 where we can recycle a material when this particular type can't be recycled? And I think part of it is to encourage manufacturers to change the source of what they're making so that it can be recyclable. Or am I missing a point in the discussion here that you've had at the state level regarding this particular measure?
I'd like to answer that one, Commissioner Buck. Sorry, I just got a brain fart. I'm afraid I would have to say that the statement that styrofoam food packaging is not recyclable isn't 100% accurate, because it's technically recyclable. Access to that recycling does not extend to our community, and it doesn't extend much further than, I don't know how many miles away from the town of Tigard, Oregon, where there is a company called Agilix. There is a way of processing styrofoam back down into a resin that can be sold again. So it's conceivably possible to recycle this material. And also St. Vincent de Paul is recycling the block foam, but I guess that's a different material. That's the one thing I wanted to clear up, and now I don't remember the second half of your question. Sorry.
Well, I think the crux of my question is, this Senate bill is a way in which to encourage manufacturers to produce materials that can be recycled and life of the product. For those things that are considered non-recyclable, I hear you definitely saying that, well, this could be recycled if we have an Agilex near us. And the probability of another one of those in our area, I don't know, it hasn't arrived, and it may or may not come to fruition. It would be great if we had a manufacturing type of Agilex facility that had a marketplace for the end product. And if that occurred, how long would that take to actually come to fruition in an area where we could actually see that recyclable material come into another product, and we would discontinue filling our landfill full of products that are non-recyclable, where taxpayers foot the bill for the end life of those products at the moment?
Mm-hmm. You bring up a good point. The Senate Bill 582, the structure, from my observation, the structure that would be developed if adopted into rule, into law, the producers then would be responsible for either paying extra fees or building more Agilex facilities around the state. So that is the purpose of Senate Bill 582, is to add additional motivation to these producers to connect up the recyclability to more of Oregonians. Whether that is the solution needed in this case, because as I said, recycling is one thing, but it is not the end all. Waste reduction is, of course, the best solution. But in cases when waste reduction cannot happen, something that's recyclable would probably be the next best thing. And again, the SB 582 proposes that it would not come from taxpayer dollars. That effort to increase recyclability would come from the producers.
Are you through, Commissioner? Okay. Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Bernie, and thank you, Sarah and Jeff, for your presentations. I'm looking at Senate Bill 582 as a recycle bill. The point that I'm going to make is that as we were planning for today's work session, much of the testimony that we've received and much of what I've been responding to is just a ban on food service polystyrene, whatever the jurisdiction may be, whether it be Lane County or Lane County outside the UGBs or the entire Lane County. Now, we have a number of other communities that are already enacting that across the United States, not just here. So it's something that clearly is relatively easy to do. And as far as replacing the containers that are currently being used by something that is acceptable, that's not polystyrene, the manufacturing process is already there. We already have means of supply. So my question is this, and I'll preface it just a little bit. If I go to Panda Express, I don't know how many people do, but you get a polystyrene container. And what to do with it? Well, I don't know, you make it not take up as much room in your garbage can, I guess, and send it to the landfill. And as Jeff said, once it's buried, it's out of sight, out of mind, and it's not causing any greenhouse gas issues, but it's going to be there for a long, long time. If I go to McDonald's, my Big Mac, which I've not had for many years, but if I were to do such, would come in a paper container, which is not polystyrene, but once again, it's not recyclable in our system because it has food waste on it. So not unlike the polystyrene container, it goes to the landfill, gets buried, and is out of sight forever. However, we would presume that it does decompose more rapidly inside the landfill. So the question that I have is, and the question that people have been forwarding to me is, why are we not simply looking at a ban on polystyrene food containers and not something more far-reaching, which I believe is a completely separate track, the Senate Bill 582 and recycling? I think what I was hoping to look at and what I was expecting to look at was, how do we ban the polystyrene containers, such as, well, some restaurants provide polystyrene, some restaurants provide paper. Their end of life is basically the same as it is right now in the landfill. However, once in the landfill, future generations are going to dig up the polystyrene, whereas the paper may be worms or whatever, or decompose completely. So, Mr. Chair, and to Alex and Mr. Mokrajewski, if you're, I don't see you, but I think you're there. Can we not just talk about banning polystyrene containers inside the jurisdiction that we choose? Or am I missing the track here a little bit? Or are we actually talking about that, but we're also talking about Senate Bill 582, which is more of a far-reaching recycling effort.
Does anyone want to respond to Commissioner Farr's question? We can't hear you, Alex.
I could give that a shot, Mr. Chair. And Commissioner Farr, I think the issue that we identified, Commissioner Farr, is that unless you can determine a way to have to fit a polystyrene ban into a public health issue, your limited ordinance writing does just only hit the unincorporated regions of Lane County. So the tools available to you are sort of limited and create a bifurcated system within the county. And I would submit that, a sort of a community by community banning of materials also creates bifurcation and a patchwork nature of policies, which industry tends to really dislike. And what the discussion about Senate Bill 582 that I think is important is it would have statewide effect, and it would put the decision-making into the hands of industry rather than into the hands of local government, but with some real tools that would help to influence that decision-making that didn't exist before 582. So the sort of, the idea of bringing Senate Bill 582 to your attention is just an option for you to consider in a real system-wide, Oregon-wide change, rather than a sort of the limited tools that you have available. Now, Jeff did describe that, and we did discuss in preparing for this meeting, that you also have the ability to write an ordinance that says the landfill shall ban the acceptance of these materials. He briefly stated that that would be a very difficult ordinance to enforce. And it does have the potential for actually diverting garbage out of Lane County, which is also poses some problems for the system that we have in place here locally.
Commissioner Farr, it looks like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, and I thought Alex was finished, but you've kind of reiterated the presentation that was made prior to the question that I asked, and I do understand that, and I do understand the proposed value of Senate Bill 582, but the people who testified this morning, and for the last year, much of the email that I've been receiving has been specifically toward food containers. And Terry McDonald mentioned the clamshell food containers. I guess that's basically what they are, the clamshell food containers. Now, clearly, polystyrene goes far beyond clamshell food containers. However, the city of Newport has banned food containers, clamshell food containers, as has Ashland, as has San Francisco. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And they seem to be doing it without a multi-tiered effect. I understand that as the Board of County Commissioners, we can only pass an ordinance that is outside of the jurisdictions of the cities. But why could we not fashion an ordinance that is a Board of Health ordinance? Are you stating that there's really no language that we can use there? I'm not interested in the landfill exclusion because that's impossible to enforce. But is there not a Board of Health ordinance that we can create that would work for the entire of Lane County and get us all under the same, under the same umbrella? And that way people from Benton County could still bring their stuff to our landfill.
Chair Bernie and Commissioner Farr, I am not the expert on that public health. Your governance body seated as the local Board of Public Health. So I think that would be a question for County Council about whether you could suggest that a public health emergency or a public health issue exists due to the presence of clamshell containers in the waste stream.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you once again for your diligence and for talking me through this. I do understand that. I guess my point is that I thought we had been talking about this as a countywide ban for the last year or so, even though everything's been put on hold. And if we get nothing more from this work session today, I hope it does move forward as an issue, as a Board of Health issue, that we can move forward on banning, I'll call them clamshell food containers inside the entire county, therefore not creating a multi-jurisdictional, multi-level effect. So that's pretty much all I have to say. Chair Bernie, not quite all I have to say, but the people that I've been speaking to, and I've received testimony from a lot of people inside of my office, inside the grocery stores, wherever, about this, and it really is toward those clamshells that cities have banned. And I think there's a strong move afoot to ban them in Lane County and to make it an enforceable ordinance with teeth that actually does have an immediate effect, notwithstanding needing to build new plants for sorting. I mean, it just outlaws it completely, and it's not novel, and there is a manufacturing stream for product to replace it, and it's not very much more expensive, I understand. So that is actually the end, hoping that we do have something out of this work session today that has us moving toward consideration of a countywide ban on clamshell. I'll just call it clamshell for the sake of convenience. So thank you. And thank you for my indulgence, Chair. Thank you, Alex, for your patience in explaining that to me 3 times. But I will tell you, I did get it the first time.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Is there another commissioner Commissioner Trieger?
Thank you, Chair. I want to preface my comments by just circling back to the very first thing Ms. Grimm said, because I think it's the most important thing and we have to hold it all the time, which is that ultimately reducing the amount of these kind of products and our use of them is the ultimate and best goal. And the second is products that can be reused, and that recycling should be the final option. And so anything we can do to move us toward that should always be our first goal. I appreciate hearing about Senate Bill 582. I'm in favor. I think we should be supporting it and doing everything like we can as individual commissioners and as a board and as an organization to support it, because I do think the onus has to be on producers. And the only way to get us to healthier options with takeout and packaging materials and so on is to start as far upstream as possible. And that is with the producers. That's the way to change culture through policy, and policy through culture is to change it in an industry rather than individual behavior. And that brings me to the public health question. We know from public health practice for decades, centuries really, but for decades, that individual behavior change is not the place to start. And the way to change individual behavior is to change the systems in which individuals are interacting with. So another check mark in the favorable column of trying to pass things like Senate Bill 582. But specifically to the public health risks of polystyrene when it comes to being used as food packaging, and it's not just the clamshells, it's also the cups, particularly the hot liquids are in, is the chemical interaction that happens when, and then the fact that someone is ingesting the item that is being interacting with that polystyrene. We don't drink or eat something that is interacted with hard foam block packaging that electronics come in. It's a very separate public health issue. All polystyrene, all styrofoam, all of it is a public health, environmental public health issue. But when it comes to individual human health, there are very unique and specific concerns and real problems, particularly as we heard in testimony this morning when it comes to developing children's brains and bodies and endocrine systems. So I think, I think it's worth talking to have a parallel track here to talk about what we can do around systems change, industry change, and so that we're not putting the burden on individual communities or individual businesses, particularly restaurants in this COVID environment. Anything we do that makes it harder for restaurants to operate is going to be a challenge for the next, I'll say, 2 years or so. But I really appreciate Commissioner Farr bringing us back to the very specific issue that we were asked to take up before I was even on the board and that we heard about this morning, which is about serviceware, things that people are ingesting, something that has interacted with these chemical products. And I think that is a very separate and specific issue, and that we could explore that from a public health position differently from the broader issue of all polystyrene and the recycling issues.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm seeing one or two commissioners squirming that suggests they may have additional things to say. And so I'll start another round with the caveat that I get to speak at any point I want because you've all spoken already. Okay. Commissioner Bozovich, did you want to speak?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I do a lot come up, and I want to try and address a few of them. First, I'll just remind folks of bisphenol A, or what was known as BPA. It's a product that's in, hardens clear plastic and is used in other epoxy resins. We found out that it wasn't really good for us, and the public found out that. Now you can't buy a water bottle that has bisphenol A in it because the consumers stopped buying those products and the producers chose to produce products without it and advertise the lack of BPA in their products as a selling point. So, the market, changed that particular product, and without even government interference, you don't find BPA out in the market very much at all anymore. That said, we have to be careful about unintended consequences of our actions. And I'll ask a quick question, and if I can come back and comment on afterwards. But Jeff or Sarah, what happens to paper and cardboard in the landfill? Does it become methane?
Yes, it decomposes and becomes methane.
Thank you. So right now, our polystyrene, it goes into landfill, just sits there and doesn't decay because it's basically inert. We put food waste containers that are paper and cardboard in there, it generates methane, and our landfill is our largest greenhouse gas generator in the county. So if climate change is your concern, polystyrene is a good thing for that reason. Now, I don't think polystyrene is a great thing because of the chemical issues and heating with it, but I do think consumers can start demanding other products at that end. We have no other county code that bans a consumer product, nor do we have any county divisions that are charged with enforcing bans of consumer products, and we would have to invent one somewhere, which means staff and other things. Because what happens when we get the phone call from John Q. Public that says, I went to such and such restaurant and they gave me a styrofoam container? Who's going to go out and tell that restaurant they're breaking a ban that we enacted? That they may not even be aware of, by the way, because when you start doing things city by city and county by county, it's very tough for industries to keep track of regulations. I am completely in favor of supporting Senate Bill 582. I think that sort of system and upstream end of regulation and a statewide regulation is far more effective than single action by a local jurisdiction. The issue about litter and contamination of waterways isn't a major issue in the US. We do a really great job of containing our plastic waste. It does end up in landfills forever or gets recycled, but we don't necessarily litter. Of the accounted for and polluting plastic, the US is only responsible for 0.49% of the world's plastic pollution, where a country like China is responsible for 28% and Indonesia is responsible for 10%. And it works on down from there with the Philippines and Vietnam and Nigeria and Egypt and a few other countries being the top producers of plastic waste. We're not exactly the issue here in Lane County is 0.1% of the US population that's only 0.49% of plastic pollution. So I would say let's stick with supporting a statewide system. We can look at the paint industry as a great indicator of how that can be done, whether it's returned to the store or some other way. We don't know how they might choose to work this. And we could also try and educate people about the dangers of polystyrene in food containers and have them pressure their own restaurants for an option that's not polystyrene, just as consumers pressured the water bottle industry out of using bisphenol A. You know, we don't need always to take action. There, you know, I call it the do something disease that we get into sometimes with government, where we have to do something. And sometimes when we do something wrong. And you know, there's an unintended consequence. What you're going to do is add to the paper waste stream into our landfill, something that degrades into a very powerful greenhouse gas. And it won't change the volume coming into our landfill. In fact, if anything, it's a heavier weight, you know, as far as the hauling costs go. But, you know, we really should, I think, go with option B, do nothing at this time, do everything we can to support Senate Bill 582, a good version of it, and move on.
Thank you. I also want to thank Ms. Grimm. Can I call you Sarah? Okay, I want to thank you for your time, because this is taking a little longer, and I hope you can stay with us through till the end.
Sure.
Or Jeff and Alex don't have a choice. Is there any other commissioner that would like to make a statement or ask a question? Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. I appreciate Commissioner Bozovich's comments, and I particularly appreciate the sort of inherent conflict. I mean, you're correct when it comes to the impacts on the landfill and generating methane or not, and the heavier, you know, the weight of that includes the transportation weight of bringing product into the community before it's even used, which just bears out. It's a giant game of whack-a-mole. You know, you address one problem somewhere and it could pop another one up. And to my mind, that only serves to enforce that, rather than to say that, you know, do something as if it's a bad idea to do something about a problem, is do everything we can, fire on as many cylinders as possible at once to address the multifaceted intersectional problems that we as a society and through industry that we've allowed to create harmful product have created. So I opt for you know, options both A and B, that we continue to explore the options specifically around food serviceware and polystyrene from a public health perspective, and we support efforts at the statewide level to regulate and support industry in doing better. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I'm not going to speak yet. Commissioner Butt.
Thank you, Chair. This is more of a question for staff. And when we speak of this as a public health issue, that would beg the question, has there been any committees in our public health department that have reviewed or have an established way in which to review requests of this kind that would then come to our greater board to consider? Is there a subgroup that reviews, you know, things that come into our environment here in the county that we should consider bans? And if we don't, should we? I would think that I would want some professionals in the industry to be able to review these kinds of requests as they come in, and then that be presented to us for a course of action.
Chair Bernie, Commissioner Buck, you do have a public health advisory committee. That might be an appropriate place for that kind of discussion. In terms of previous efforts, the only thing that's jumping to my mind is that we did have a proposal in front of a board many years ago to have a menu labeling ordinance locally. There was also pending legislation at the time. And as I recall, I think you did pass an ordinance, and then the statewide overlay came into play for statewide menu labeling to show calorie counts. And it's a little different because we already do have a restaurant inspection program at the county. And so they were able to add the duties of making sure that local restaurants were in compliance with not only the ordinance, but the statewide law when it came into effect. Could I just add, Mr. Chair, that I read to you a section of the bill that spoke to the hydraulic with respect to the recyclability of material. The section actually does go on and does give that product stewardship organization the authority to modulate its fees based on human health impacts of covered products as well. So it's not particularly clear to me how that might be implemented, but given the conversation about polystyrene and its effect on human health, you would assume that there would be some discussion within the product stewardship organization as it sets fees as to the human health implications for a given covered product.
Thank you. As much as the chair has no control over this, Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you, Chair. This is very brief. I just wanted to add, I'm glad Mr. Kyler brought up menu labeling. I was actually part of the coalition that was lobbying the Board of County Commissioners at the time, working to pass that policy. And it really only bears out, we did in fact then pass the statewide law, which then actually was subsumed by federal policy, which required menu labeling for restaurants of a certain size at the federal level, which really shows that yes, it's the larger the system, the better, but also shows that it is actually exactly the pressure from the grassroots and the individual communities that creates the momentum and shows the constituent will, which then informs the political will to get these things done. So again, we need it at the large scale and the small scale happening all at once, until eventually it creates sort of an inevitability of doing the right thing for people and the planet.
Well, I'd like to, gee, Sarah, I had so much to say, but it all just escaped me. No, I'm just kidding. First, I'd like to say that I shared Vice Chair's FAR perception that we have on our agenda item, discussion on ban of styrofoam, polystyrene, and the vast majority of this conversation has been about the system-wide impacts of a Senate Bill 582. I support, as it sounds like most commissioners do. And by the way, Sarah, if you're one of the architects of that, I appreciate your farsightedness, your commitment to seeing that through. It's a good thing. Now, having said that, 12 years ago, I went over and took a look at Agilix, since that seems to be the thing that's being touted here. And I sure, if they still only have that one location, we're in trouble. I'm assuming they do. I went over there with a group, of officials from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras that related to work I was doing at the time. Good company here locally facilitated that. And it was work that I then was doing in Central America. 12 years ago. We don't have an Agilix now here. Nobody's got an Agilix except Tigard. You know, that's the reality. So while we are needing, my opinion, while we are needing to create product stewardship systems and incentives, because so much of the environmental issues of the day relate to manufacturers that don't recoup the true costs of production and the costs of cleanup in the costs of a product. So I appreciate that very much. I also, on the one hand, when we made that visit, by the way, the issue of plastic and styrofoam was not for these three countries the issue of how much of it ended in Lane County's landfill. It wasn't the issue of how much of it was recyclable and how fast it turned into methane or didn't. The issue was it was littering their shorelines. It was inside of the fish that they were fishing. It was inside of the food that they were eating, and it was plastic bags. I wish I had taken videos of plastic bags lining the streets of Sushi Toto and San Salvador and all these places that we went. It was unbelievable. You wouldn't even, it truly was. So my own opinion, getting back to the task at hand, is that I think we should take up either banning, or if that's not practical, if that's not practicable, I don't know if this body or our Board of Public Health has ever been able to issue an advisory encouraging municipalities in Lane County where there is that kind of enforceability to ban polystyrene. But I think that I agree with Commissioner Trieger and the comments Commissioners Buck and Farr made. I think that while we're building the system, we also have to take care of some of the most egregious environmental issues that impact public health. So thank you. And Sarah, would you like to respond to any of what I said? I didn't mean to be, I wasn't critical. I was just giving my perspective on the subject.
Thank you, Chair Bernie. I did feel for a moment that I should sort of defend ourselves in terms of we did not intend to put up the SB 582 as a sort of a bait and switch or something to divert the conversation. I think what happens is that when people look at talking about this material, they automatically go towards the waste management folks. And we only have certain tools in our belt in regards to that. And so I applaud the commissioners for aiming towards a public health direction because that is what's at issue, and it would put it under what I feel, knowing nothing, appropriate place. So thank you so very much for all your great thoughts on this. I'm very excited to hear it.
So where do we go from here, Board, on this topic? This is just a discussion topic. Commissioner Buck?
After hearing all the comments and knowing that we have in the past brought up some food-related issues to our Board of Health advisory group, it seems logical to me to ask that this be something they consider and review, and then bring back to us as a board with their input and potential policy choices. That's just a suggestion. I'm open to other ideas as well.
No, you're bailing me out. Thank you, Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Bernie. I think that Commissioner Buck kind of summed it up pretty well right there, because such a work session would help us to include the discussion that Commissioner Bozevich, a very pertinent discussion that Commissioner Bozevich just inserted into the conversation, and that there are multiple side effects of what appears to be a simple ban. There's nothing simple about it. And for us to have that full conversation, and as the Board of Health, with the intent of potentially, I mean, the outcome would be a county-wide ban or not a county-wide ban. Those are the two potential outcomes. So I would agree with Commissioner Buck, tell me if I'm not agreeing with you. Tell me if I'm agreeing with something that I didn't hear you say, but that a work session for the Board of Health regarding what a ordinance might look like and what the side effects would be.
Yeah, if I may, Commissioner, it sounds like you're also asking for a recommendation from the Board of Health.
Yes, that would be inclusive in that.
I see.
Sorry, just to clarify, from their advisory committee.
Thank you. I knew I said that wrong. I see 4 head nods and 1 hand up from Commissioner Bozevich.
Yeah. I was going to ask if we could, I'm happy with having the Public Health Advisory Committee look this over, but at the same time, could we get some idea of what the cost will be to set up a program and then enforce a ban? We have to get the resource somewhere, and we had a long discussion this morning about our public safety repair plan. We've talked about our needs in mental health, and funding enforcement of a polystyrene ban when it's something I think is going to happen through market forces eventually anyway, may not be the best use of our funds. And if we're going to have a Public Health Advisory Committee look at this, I'd also like to have some idea from staff. One, how much we're spending now just talking about this. We've got 3 staff members in the board for the last hour, sorry. And we're talking about more time with, presenting to a Public Health Advisory Committee and getting recommendations, and then eventually developing code and everything else. We're talking thousands of dollars at this point. And who knows how much to go through an enforcement. Is there FTE involved? I want to understand that.
Thank you. If I may, we're all of 10 minutes over on this topic. And I felt the topic worthy enough for that. Because of my concerns about just what you were discussing, Commissioner, that's why I felt there might be a third choice, not a binary choice, which is an advisory, where our county does in fact state that we believe in this and we encourage other municipalities to. But I have a funny feeling if we did the figuring out you're suggesting, we find out we don't have the enforcement capacity. So at any rate, unless for the good of the order, I'm going to have Commissioner Trieger speak, and then we are going to move on. Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you, Chair. This is really brief, and it's a question. If we want individuals, we want market forces to change habit around what we ask of our food service industry in terms of options for takeout or hauling leftovers home. It seems some restaurants are fine with you bringing your own container. Some say you can't. So we maybe should also look at whether there are opportunities to incentivize or at least sort of use Good Samaritan laws to clear the way for that to be an option for consumers, because that doesn't seem to be anything that's on any kind of books anywhere, and individual restaurants get to say they're scared of liability or sure, that's fine. So that's another opportunity and a place that we could maybe inform and help with personal behavior change and community education campaign, both on the industry and on the consumer side. Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, the elephant in the room is the population continues to explode. The consumption continues to increase, but here we are. Commissioners, we are going to need to make sure that this, as Commissioner Buck and Farr suggested, that this gets to the Public Health Advisory Body, that we give them the right instructions for a recommendation, and that we schedule hearing this fairly soon. We are now going to move on. Sarah and Jeff and Alex, thank you so much for a very rigorous presentation.
Thank you.
County Council, are there any announcements?
Chair Bernie and Board of the Commissioners, no, there are not. I'm ready to move directly to the redistricting matter.
Well, if County Council is ready to move directly to 12B, far be it from us to get in his way.
Oh. All right, and you should have, I forwarded all of you an email that maybe it came to you independently from PSU regarding the census data and the congressional redistricting. Sent it to you, I think, just either during the lunch hour or just before the lunch hour. So I wanted to make sure you saw that. We made pretty good progress at the last board meeting on this. And so in your materials, you'll see a document entitled 2021 Independent Citizens Redistricting Committee. And this is really the bare bone, or the outline of what an ordinance would look like. Now, one of the things that I did in talking to some folks who were involved in the process the last time, and one that we didn't address, that really the piece that I sort of filled in there in red was alternates, because apparently this is going to be it's going to be a fairly long commitment and rigorous. People never know what's going to happen in their life, and apparently one of the places where friction developed was when someone had to leave and there was no process for replacing them. So what I suggested, and again, you're free to disregard it, but from picking, for doing a number of long jury trials where you have the same sort of process, we selected alternates. If we're doing a 6 or 8 week capital murder case, there's a chance you're going to lose a juror. So what they did is you had the regular juror, jurors, if you will, and then you picked 3 alternates. Now, one of the things that they did with the alternates is some judges would not tell the alternates who were the alternates because they thought they paid more attention. The other judges said that would identify them as alternates, but not list their number. In other words, that you were the first alternate, second alternate, third alternate. Again, to have people maintain, if you will, attention and interest. So what I've done here is left it open. Certainly you could pick more, but I've put in there that there is all our alternates. And what I would suggest is that you'll see that one of the other documents I created was a set of draft bylaws for the committee. And that might be something that the committee themselves could decide upon, how they were going to select the alternates from the pool that has been created. It could be random, it could be anything. And then the other parts of and so that's the other major document that's in there. And then the other things are just drafts of the application form, the advertising for the vacancy. I did want to tell you, I didn't realize it was going to be this difficult. I actually got on the phone with the Oregon Government Ethics Committee, trying to get the current version of the disclosure form, and was told that I could not get that version unless you were one of the people who was required to fill out the disclosure. So I have managed to find a 2011 version of that form online and printed out. The person I spoke with at the Government Ethics Commission told me that he thought it was substantially similar to the one that is currently being used and that there were no major differences. So that's all I have. It's really up to you folks from here as far as I'm here to take your input. And again, I think the next step would be to finalize those sort of decision points and choices regarding the ordinance, and then it would come back to you in the form of, the formal form of an ordinance in the first reading and all that sort of thing.
Forgive me, I was muted. Commissioners, any questions, comments? Commissioner Buck?
After reviewing this, I was actually thinking about this earlier too. I'm very supportive of the alternate members. I know that can be an issue. But I do have one question in the documents, which is showing on my page as page 9 of 16 in the attached material, specifically the language that we would be putting in an ordinance. It is under number 3, selection of ICRC, section B, which is how we choose the original 15 members.
Mm-hmm.
This section says the 5 regular members selected by the 5 commissioners would select the remaining 10 regular members and 3 alternates, which is fine. And in subsection I, it goes on to say the process used by the 5 regular members to select the remaining 10 and 3 alternate is left to their discretion. And what triggered me to ask is that in all the other papers, in the attachment, we go to great lengths to talk about equity and inclusion of those members, but that is not stated in this draft of what would be put in the ordinance itself. It just says left to their discretion without including any specific language about the equity qualities we want in the committee. So my suggestion would be to add something about that as we have in the application and all that. But otherwise, as I read it, it was very spot on to what we discussed in our last meeting.
Chair Bernie, Commissioner Buck, that'd be no problem at all. I can go back and actually take the same. So sounds like what you want is the language identical to the one that considered the qualifications for the applicant for the 5 commissioners. I could just cut and paste that and put it in there. Absolutely. And again, I want to emphasize, I tried to, sometimes there were choices to be made. Other times I just I filled in gaps, but this is the place for you to make comments so that, and it's not carved in stone. I know Commissioner Bernie was questioning the name of it, so you can rename it if you want.
Commissioner Buck, did you have your hand up again?
I did, but I have a totally different question, so I'll let Commissioner Traeger go first and let others go before I come back.
I didn't realize your hand was up, Commissioner Traeger. Is your hand up?
Thank you. I am curious, Mr. Dingle, and just echoing Commissioner Buck's concerns. I know when we met last and discussed this, I had recommended running it through the committee, the internal committee that's working on developing our equity lens for the organization overall, and having this be an opportunity to sort of pilot and put into practice, even though that's still in its formative creation. But I think it would really benefit from running through that group to speak to what Commissioner Buck raised and some other sort of here and there issues that I have with it. And so wondering if that happened. And then the other is I share Commissioner Bernie's desire to maybe consider a new name simply to not use the word citizen in this particular. I don't know if that was your concern, Commissioner Bernie, but to not use that in titling a commission.
Chair Bernie, Commissioner Trigger, I did not understand that it was that I tried to put in there that about the considerations. I did not know that there was a proposal for an exact. I'm trying to figure out where that would be. So would it be that under 3 that it would be I would remain the same, which is the personally identifying information would be removed. Then 2, it would be referred to the Equity and Access Committee. But what would their charge be?
Oh, Chair Bernie, Mr. Dingell, no, I simply meant for your team's benefit that having that group look at this proposed document.
Oh, I'm sorry.
To help us in shaping it in a way that then reflects the values that we have around equity and the language that we're using and the process that we're using to ensure that we seat this committee in a way that reflects the community.
Sorry, Chair Bernie, Commissioner, that makes a lot more sense. Okay, I understand.
Any other commissioner? Well,
I just have to ask, why is citizens a bad word? I mean, it's not elected officials. The idea was, and I believe that a lot of the California redistricting committees are referred to as citizen committees. I'm kind of curious what's wrong with that word.
Chair Bernie, may I respond?
Yeah, because in all honesty, I don't recall the reference Mr. Dingell made. So please, Commissioner Trigger.
Thank you. Commissioner Buzzard, citizen is not a bad word. California is free to name their committees whatever they like. My comment was simply that it's not that it's a bad word, it's that it can be perceived if what we're trying to do is present ourselves with a public face that is inclusive as being an exclusive word. We had quite a bit of conversation at our last meeting, in fact, about eligibility to vote doesn't have to be a requirement to weigh in about redistricting. And so I'm simply just trying to be a little bit proactive in how we're being perceived as to whether we're being inclusive and who has a right or might have helpful input to this process from our community.
And if I may, at this point, now I do recall, Commissioner Bozovich, yeah, it's not a bad word, obviously. The context back then, at least for me to question that, was that if you recall, there was so much politicization about who was even going to be counted in the census, and there was going to be a citizenship question on the census. And in that context, that's where I had the issue with that word, for what it's worth. And I know Commissioner Farr has his hand up.
Actually, Chair Burnett, I didn't. I was scratching my chin, but I'm a citizen. I think I technically am a citizen. That's all I would say. Not
a big issue to me. Any other comments? Commissioner, oh yes, Commissioner Buck.
County.
I'll come back around with a different question. The one thing that caught my eye in the title was actually 2021, because as the census has now been delayed 6 months, and the state also has to do their work generally before we do our work, that I brought this up with Council Dingles, that as soon as I heard that it's a 6-month delay, it immediately popped into my mind that we weren't going to be able to meet our obligation of redistricting by October 26th of this year, due to the extended timeline and all that goes into the effort to redistrict after the census is released. And so I was hoping that Mr. Dingle could talk about that a little bit, and if this will roll into 2022. Which is what I think is logical.
Chair Bernie, Commissioner Buck, yes, you're correct. And I did send an email to all of the board, basically putting out some of those options. But to recap it, the difficulty is, of course, that is in the charter. And the charter is like the Constitution for the county, so an ordinance can't change it, or a Blaine Manual Code can't change it. And one of the things I know that the board wants to do is avoid controversy. And what Commissioner Buck is saying is absolutely true. If they actually stick to their timelines, I believe they said they would provide the census data on September 30th, and the last redistricting was done on October 26th. The last ordinance was adopted October. Let's face it, there's no way that it's going to get done in 26 days or 27 days, or not. If they met around the clock, they probably couldn't do that. So the concern I have too is that I don't want anyone to challenge the process, in the sense of, that what comes afterwards, which will, Commissioner Buck, to your point, absolutely probably will go into 2022. I think it would be a real challenge for that group, even if you're talking about the end of September, you're talking about really just 3 months, and obviously a couple of holidays in there in between to get that work accomplished. So what I've suggested is that there is a process whereby you use the most current census data, which would be the most current census data would be the last one. The lines remain where they are, and after the comes in, says you can't do it more. Nothing says you can't do it more often. It says you have to do it at least every 10 years. And what I would suggest is that, I think a good point that was made by Commissioner Buck, that that be done by ordinance, and make it crystal clear what's absolutely going on here, which is that we're in a situation that nobody foresaw. Sure, when that provision was drafted and put in the charter, which I think is actually back from the original adoption in 1962, no one could have imagined a pandemic that was going to hold up the census data. So that would make it clear to everyone that the expectation is that there is going to be this committee that is going to continue work and is going to come up with a redistricting plan, probably in early 2022, but it will use the most recent data, which is what I think is first and foremost on the board's mind, which is it does no good to do it either not. In my mind, it makes no sense to try and rush through something that's incomplete. That leaves you subject to challenge that it was not well thought out. And number two, do it without, on a permanent level, without the most current information. And I think that's one way I think that splits, that basically deals with all the issues and is the one that creates the least risk of challenge to whatever is ultimately developed by the committee.
Are there any other comments or questions?
Chair Bernie, one more point. I would say that's another one of those things that I think when we're coming up on, at the same time that redistricting occurs, there's going to be a charter committee, review committee appointed. This is one of those provisions that I think probably needs to be looked at, and some sort of, perhaps some proposal, so that in the event that something like this happens in the future, it's addressed.
Thank you, Councillor. Commissioner Bozovich.
You're muted.
We can't hear you, Commissioner.
Sorry, I thought I clicked the button.
You did, the mute button.
Yeah. No, I was just wondering, do we need to even make a reference to a year at all? I was hoping that once we set up this system, it might be reused in 2031 and on beyond. So is there any reason to even have the year referenced in the ordinance and everything in all the materials?
No, Chair Bernie, Commissioner Bozovich, I think that if I understood correctly, the board's ultimate desire was to, if you will, test drive that. Well, you have to adopt it as an ordinance. That's what's in the, that's what's in the charter. But I understood the board's desire here was to create this committee to essentially test drive it through this process, sort of review it at the end, make any changes, tweaks, improvements that the board thought it needed after having gone through the process, and ultimately propose that to in the form of a charter amendment, which would then drop the notice. You'll notice that I put this in a standalone chapter of the code. This is a new chapter at the end. It's a standalone. And I did that for two reasons. I didn't think it fit very well within other things. And I also thought it was important that it be singled out because of how important it is, that it not be lost in other places.
Does that answer your question, Commissioner? Yeah.
No.
Okay. Any other comments? I would just like to, oh, I'm sorry.
I was going to ask, I also wondered if anyone had any other comments on the either the bylaws the draft bylaws that I did, or the other forms that were in it, the application, the vacancy notice, any suggestions on those. My thought on the bylaws was to give the group a jump, if you will. In other words, not have them start with a blank piece of paper. At least have the form of an outline of some things that they could look at.
If I may, to directly respond to your question, as long as they're draft, I personally would have no issue with that and allow them to have that choice. I did want to make a couple of additional comments though. One is Commissioner Trieger recommended that you get language as it related to inclusiveness, I believe, and diversity from the equity advisory task force. Before that's integrated in, I would like that to be a recommendation to this body, this board, so we could look at that language and then either direct you to include it or make some changes in it. But I'm going to suggest that be the process, if that's okay. I think it still meets the intent of the request. And the other item is, my recollection was there were really two groups that kind of stayed with this and spent a lot of time and substantively input and really gave us a format to develop now what you're presenting to us. And that was the League of Women Voters, if memory serves, tell me if I'm wrong, and the Democratic Party of Lane County. So I'm wondering within this, and if there are others, that's fine. I'm wondering if within this process, we would want them to take a look at this draft and just provide whatever inputs they wanted to before we adopted a final process.
Chair Bernie, commissioners, we have received some, and I believe that's been forwarded. I know for certain the most recent one, I think, was sent to Commissioner Buck. Someone had made a comment based on these materials. I could certainly send it to them. My thought would be that because it is going to be an ordinance, recall it has to be adopted as an ordinance, that there was going to be an opportunity once the ordinance was formalized to allow those people. You'll obviously have first reading, people have input, public comment. Right. So I feel like I could certainly send it specifically to those groups, but it seems like there's going to be plenty of opportunity for folks to have input.
No need. No, as long as there's opportunity, I appreciate that. I'm just sensitive to the desire for transparency, which we all are, and which I know is guiding your work, Counselor. So thank you. Anyone else?
Chair Bernie, this is Commissioner Farr. I lost my video, so I'm on audio right now.
Please, Commissioner, go ahead.
And I have nothing to add. Thank you. But I'm monitoring.
Commissioner Buck, yes.
Do you need any guidance today on the issue of bringing up which I believe is a separate ordinance regarding the timing of redistricting this year, or will you bring up something at a future board meeting regarding that?
Chair Bernie, Commissioner Buck, I think that's a great point. What I would suggest, we're in a kind of an odd position because it seems like we do have some time. What I would suggest is that that we set this for another discussion in a month or 5 weeks. And what I do at that point is I will incorporate the changes that have been made and suggested today. I will, in the interim, run it through run the packet by the Equity and Access Board for their comment input. And then I will also present a draft of an ordinance, again, not a first reading or anything, just a draft to address the timing issue for the board to consider. If that's acceptable to everyone.
That's acceptable to me. I see Commissioner Buck going up and down with her head. I see Commissioner Trieger has her hand up.
Thank you, Chair. I have a clarifying question and also a clarifying comment. Comment first is when I was talking about, and I think Mr. Mokoheiski is on the line, so this may be a question for him. I was talking about our internal equity committee when I was talking about getting a sort of a read on this and some recommendation as it is, and then Councilor Dingo, you just mentioned our Equity and Access Advisory Board. So I'm actually not sure which is the right body, but originally my original suggestion was our internal committee who is developing our equity lens for us as an organization to use this as sort of a trial run. So that was actually my recommendation, not our external, not our Equity and Access Advisory Board.
I apologize. That was me.
So I want to make sure we get clarity, and also so that Council Dingell has the right direction there. But I want to make sure I'm not asking something of a group that isn't appropriate. So I don't know if Mr. Mokoheiski needs to weigh in on that. Yeah. And then my question, which is just a logistical one of timing, if we do the ordinance that accommodates for the lag in time with the census, and then we actually are doing the process of redrawing maps and our redistricting, just how that changes then the next 10 years at most cycle, and whether we want to give any thought to setting ourselves up as an organization for a more practicable timing moving forward.
Chair Bernie, Commissioner Trigger, that's what I was saying, which is, I mean, the only way that can happen is with the charter amendment change, and certainly it would establish, if you will, the process of that there, theoretically you do two depending on the circumstances there, and I think that's really just a policy decision. I constantly say this, which is I think it's if we haven't learned anything, but we should have learned that we need to be a lot more flexible from this pandemic. And I think it's something that you can give to future boards, which is that flexibility to deal with, emergency situations. I do think it would be, my personal feeling is it would be good to get the process started and get this committee selected so they could start working on their bylaws. They could start. I mean, there's things that they don't need to, at least in my opinion, I don't think they need to sit around and do nothing and waiting until September 30th for the census data to drop. I think they can have a lot of work done, ready to just literally hit the ground running the day that the census data becomes available.
Great, thank you. And just does that 10-year clock start ticking when?
Well, it started ticking October 26th of 2011 because that was the last time the board adopted an ordinance redrawing the boundaries.
I understand, Chair Bernie. I mean, moving forward with the new, the next round of redistricting. So if we do an ordinance that says keep them the same because we don't have time to account for census, and then we actually do potentially draw new maps, is it once we adopt the new maps, or is that what
I think until you do a charter change, I would say it is the one that you did within the timeline is what's going to start running it. In other words, if you adopt the temporary placeholder, that's going to be the date from which it runs. And the only reason I say that is that that is the path that creates the least amount of challenge or argument to the process, because it is consistent with the existing charter. If that makes sense. And it's you nodding your head. Okay. Going forward, it may be different, but.
I noticed, Mr. Mokrahajski, did you want to input here?
I was just going to respond to the first question Commissioner Trieger asked. And yes, we do have a staff team that presented to the board a few weeks ago on the development of our equity lens. And I think it's certainly appropriate to have that staff team. It includes Ms. Inman and Mr. Rickoff and a number of other folks in the organization. So they are the most knowledgeable and I do think more appropriate than the Equity and Access Advisory Board as it relates to the intended use of our equity lens. And that's what I heard your request being. So we certainly can have them work with Mr. Dingle on reviewing this and then provide any recommendations back to the board.
Well, I would like to claim absolute credit for confusing that issue, and I apologize to Commissioner Trieger. That was obviously her original intent, and it is a good dry run. So there you go. Are there any other comments or questions? Mr. Dingle, do you have what you need?
Yes, and I was going to just, yes, I do, Chair Bernie. I was going to just suggest either April 6th or April 13th to come back with those things and maybe I just leave that up to the agenda team. But that's kind of where I'm looking, was those dates.
So we'll leave that to the agenda team, and I, as one of that group, will try and make it the earlier rather than the later so that we can move forward with this process.
Yeah. Other than that, I think I have everything, all the direction I need.
I would like to let the board know that, believe it or not, we're ahead of schedule for this afternoon now. Is now item 13, before we break into an afternoon executive committee meeting, commissioners' business. Are there any announcements from any of the commissioners? Commissioner Buck?
There tends to be a lot of movement around the potential infrastructure package on a national level. I am getting inquiries and have a lot of information coming to me via the NACO Transportation Steering Committee. I will continue to be in touch with AOC and Alex Kyler on requests of information. I may be on one panel discussion with them later this month. So as information comes to me, I'll continue to share it with the board and the general public. I just wanted everybody to be aware, even though right now it seems to be everybody's talking on the national level about the next coronavirus COVID-19 package. There is also a lot of work underway regarding that potential transportation and infrastructure package.
Thank you, Commissioner. Others? Commissioner Farr, and it's good to have you back with us, sir.
Thank you. I had to move around the house a little bit. Thank you, Chair Bernie. And really, my item kind of is a morph between A and B on Commissioner's business. It's a heads up for a future agenda team request. So I can cover that now if that works for you all.
Yes, sir.
Then what I'd like to suggest to the board is that we have a number of racial incidents that have been occurring. And as a board, Lane County's declared that racism is unjust. We often reiterate our support for equal rights and affirm the county's commitment to end disparities based on race, ethnicity, place or identity. So what I would like, probably next week, and it may be the week after, I'm going to ask for a thumbs up or acquiescence to a work session on racism as a health crisis. So looking toward a resolution declaring racism as a public health crisis in Lane County. I gave a heads up at the start of this meeting that I'd bring this up at this point in the meeting. I'm not going to ask for thumbs up at this point right now. There are some model resolutions that have been looked at, and I can forward copies of those model resolutions to Ms. Jones, who can distribute them to the board. But next week or the week after, more likely next week, I'll be asking for consideration of a resolution declaring racism as a public health crisis.
Thank you, Commissioner. We seem to have seamlessly transitioned to item 13B, future board assignment requests. Do any other commissioners have anything under this item? Commissioner Farr.
Under this item, more specifically, this is a request for just a report back, actually. So it's not a board work item, and that is regarding our Equity and Access Advisory Board. We have an Equity and Access Advisory Board, which is advisory to the county administrator. They meet once a month, and some of us have joined the meeting. Quite often, I'm a fly on the wall for the meetings. That board is advisory to the administrator. What I'm going to ask Mr. Mokrahajski is what steps would need to be taken, and what are the pros and cons of making that an advisory board or a policy recommendation board to the Board of Commissioners and switching it from its current role as advisory to the county administrator. And I'm dropping that on you almost out of the blue, Steve Mokrahajski, but it's just a request for could be an informal report back on what that would take.
Okay. I see Commissioner Krieger's hand.
Thank you, Chair. As someone who served on the Equity and Access Advisory Board, and personally, one of the things that was uniquely appealing about it, and I thought important and impactful, is that it was directly advisory to county administrator, particularly when it came to opportunities to talk about how the county's own operations were achieving goals of providing services in ways that were equitable and accessible. So I'm very curious to learn more about what prompted this request on your part, Commissioner Farr.
You're muted, Commissioner.
Thank you. I served on the City of Eugene's Human Rights Commission starting back in 1995 when Greg Rickoff was the administrator for that body. It went through a number of changes through the years, and is a very different organization than it was 20 years ago when I first joined it. So the question that has been arising with a few people who have just mentioned it to me is that the county, the Board of Commissioners, does not necessarily have a similar board that reports to them, to us, and really, I don't know the pros or cons, all of the pros and cons of it. So this is really just a kind of a fact-finding drilling down to see what it would take and what are the pros and cons of actually switching that board over. I'm not suggesting that I would make that recommendation, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about what it would be and what it would take.
Does that satisfy your question, Commissioner? Okay. Thank you, Commissioners Trieger and Farr. Is there anyone else? Seeing and hearing none, I believe this is that section of the agenda we all look forward to, the review of assignments. Mr. Mokrahajski.
To see if I've been paying attention.
Exactly, yes.
So I heard Commissioner Farr sort of tease a request that he's going to bring next week. So I'm not noting that. The first one regarding racism as a public health emergency. So I'm kind of, I noted it, but we're not going to call it out or put it on the assignments list because you didn't specifically request it. But the second one, I did hear a request for a report back on the pros and cons related to the making the Equity and Access Advisory Board advisory to the Board of Commissioners. And is that right? So that is a request, Commissioner? Now you're
muted, Commissioner.
I'm sorry, I just muted myself. I could just just a 2 or 3 paragraph report back as to what the general feeling about that is, Mr. Mokrahajski.
Yeah, and I'm happy to, now I want to make sure that there are head nods from commissioners for that. I'm happy to do that. I'm not sure, I certainly can provide a perspective on potential pros and cons, although I would say I'm not necessarily the authority on what, and I also can provide a little bit of the historical context on why we set it up the way that it is. So happy to report back on that, and I can consult with some of our staff on their thoughts on that as well. But I want to make sure, if it's an assignment, I just want to make sure that we have two other commissioners that are supportive of bringing that back for discussion.
Before we do that, Commissioner Farr, does what Mr. Mokrahajski said, would that satisfy your request? You're muted, sir. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Chair Bernie. Yes, it would. In particular, the latter, Mr. Mokrahajski, as to why it was we set it up as an advisory board to the the process we went through to put it as in its current iteration. And then we could potentially have a discussion as to whether or not we want to consider a change.
Do we see a couple of one more head nod besides mine for that discussion or no? Commissioner Farr, I don't see 3 head nods for that. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, so that's all I had. Did I miss anything?
Well, I've gotten a question from Diana, who my guess is could speak for herself. Not sure what future agenda team request means. Is it an assignment? And my understanding was that we're simply asking Councilor Dingle to report to us the next iteration incorporating the changes that were recommended today as it related to the redistricting process. But that's my interpretation. Mr. Dingle, is that your understanding?
Chair Bernie, yes, it is, and with the additional piece that I would be coming up with the draft to deal with the timing issue.
Commissioners, do we have that correct? Okay.
And the redistricting item it's an existing assignment, I believe. Yes. So we can add. Diana does a good job of just kind of adding the new pieces to that. So we can add that to that open item.
Okay.
Chair Bernie.
Yes, God.
And County Administrator, we also had a discussion about directing PHAC, the polystyrene item to be sent to the PHAC, but we did not get head nods nor an assignment made on that, and I'm not sure if we want one. And one more quick thing, April 13th is a down week, so Mr. Dingle, your item would need to be April 6th.
And forgive me, I saw 4 head nods. Maybe I'm incorrect.
Correct, but we typically do the assignments under agenda team requests just to get a double, to confirm all those, and that's where the public can go verify the assignments.
So do we need to do anything for that to be an assignment?
If possible, if we could clarify what the assignment actually is and who the head nods are, that would help my record keeping. Yes, thank you.
Commissioner Buck, would you mind in that you articulated, if you recall, what you requested that we agreed to?
I'll do my best.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
It was to assign the potential polystyrene ban on serviceware to the Health and Human Services Advisory Council for further guidance to the board for any policy or health-related recommendations.
That was perfect. And commissioners can refresh me if I'm incorrect, but my recollection is that Commissioners Buck, Trieger, Farr, and myself nodded to that. Is that correct? Actually, I think Commissioner Bozovich did too, with the amendment that we look at the costs of what enforcement would actually mean. Is that correct, sir? Yeah. Okay. Okay, there you go. I think we've gotten through that. What time is it? Commissioners, would you like to take a 10 or a 15-minute break before we reconvene in executive session? I see 10 or 15, and I get thumbs up. Okay, we're going to take a 10-minute break, 3:25, reconvene in executive session. Thank you.
Chair Bernie?
Yes.
We need to read into exec session.
Oh my gosh, I am so sorry. Diana, would you do that, please?
In stereo.
Yes. The Board of County Commissioners will now meet in executive session to conduct deliberations with persons designated by the governing body to carry on labor negotiations. This executive session is held pursuant to ORS 192.6602D, which allows the Board of Commissioners to meet in executive session for the purposes listed. Representatives of the news media and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. All other members of the audience are asked to leave the room. Representatives of the news media are specifically directed not to report on any of the deliberations during the executive session, except to state the general subject of the session as previously announced. No decision may be made in executive session. The board reserves the right to come back out into public session should the need arise.
Thank you very much, Diana. I apologize for forgetting that. We will reconvene at 3:25. Thank you.